Welcome to Truthcraft, a channel devoted to pursuing the truth while playing Minecraft. In this video, I want to talk a little bit about a historical subject. Now, I know in my last few videos I've been doing arguments for God's existence, but there are other things that I'm passionate about discussing as well, and one of those things is Christian history. Now, in this video, I want to discuss the topic of the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, which occurred, of course, on St. Bartholomew's Day in 1572, and that's August 24th. Now, essentially, the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre was the slaughtering of potentially upwards of 10,000 Protestants by their Roman Catholic neighbors because of their faith. But to understand why this massacre occurred, we're going to need to understand a little bit of the history surrounding it. The Protestant Reformation began more or less in 1517 when Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the church at Wittenberg. And these theses were essentially protesting certain abuses that had cropped up in the Roman Catholic Church. But Luther didn't mean to make a split with the Roman Catholic Church. He simply wanted to reform it. What ended up happening, though, is much more. Luther ended up being excommunicated, but he and his followers in Germany began reforming the church in many areas. This Reformation spread all over Europe, and each country has its own unique and interesting history about how this occurred. But one country that has a fascinating history of Reformation, which is not talked about as much, is France. And the Reformation in France was absolutely crazy. The reason it was so crazy was because of the fierce persecution and opposition that Protestants experienced in France. That led not only to executions and imprisonments of the Protestants, but in fact led to 8 civil wars during a span of only a few decades of the 16th century. What's interesting to note is that the amount of Protestants in France at the peak of the Reformation in that country is estimated somewhere around 25% of the population. So a really significant portion of the population became Protestant. Now, the Reformation in France lagged a bit behind that in Germany and Switzerland, but by the early 1530s, things were really starting to kick off. Around this time is when strong persecution began arising against the Protestants in France. And this is largely due to what's called the Affair of the Placards. Basically, the Affair of the Placards was a night when posters were put up all over several cities throughout France, including Paris, which were anti-Roman Catholic, in particular anti the Roman Catholic Mass or Lord's Supper. And when the citizens of these French cities woke up to find these posters all over town, they were incensed. Executions as well as imprisonments ensued, and many Protestants fled, including John Calvin, who fled to Geneva, from where he would lead a lot of the theological development of the Reformation in France. Because the Protestants are such a large portion of the population, they actually have a lot of nobles and rulers on their side, and these nobles start to put up strong opposition against the King of France. Essentially, a series of wars ensue. The Protestants are granted toleration several times, but then that toleration is taken away, or an atrocity occurs, whether from Catholics or Protestants, that ignites another war. And there's a lot of unrest in the country at this time. But in the early 1570s, there was hope that there could be peace. Now, a man named Lord Coligny in August of 1572 was entering Paris to meet with the king. Lord Coligny was a Protestant military leader and hero for the Protestants. Now, someone who was very anti-Protestant, shot Coligny from an upper window, and Coligny is taken to bed injured. That night, the king, Charles IX, along with the Queen Mother, Catherine de' Medici, orders the execution of Lord Coligny in cold blood in his bed. And so a group of assassins, led by the House of Guise, a very staunchly Catholic house at this time, enters the house where Coligny is recovering and slaughters him as well as those who are with him. This bloodshed then spills over into the streets of Paris and over the next few days into about a dozen other towns throughout France. What ends up happening is that Roman Catholics believe that the king has sanctioned the killing of the Protestants. And now they believe the Protestants are seditious, they believe they're bad for society, they believe they're evil, and that they're leading people astray and away from eternal life. So you can understand the anger that many of these Catholics would have had, especially once we realize that religious considerations were of the utmost importance to people during this time. So Catholics end up taking up arms against their Protestant neighbors and slaughtering them brutally. Historians estimate potentially even upwards of 10,000 Protestants slaughtered, and there's no mercy on women or children at this time either. People are tied into sacks and thrown to drown in rivers. People are beaten to death with cudgels. Women are raped. And in general, chaos just ensues. Now, the especially tragic aspect of this massacre is that instead of condemning the violence, the King of France actually uses this as an opportunity to increase persecution against the Protestants, thinking that he can now fully drive them out of France. Many of the Protestants actually do flee, some convert back to Catholicism, and in general, they're terrified. The Pope, in general, fares no better than the King in this. He orders a Te Deum to be sung as a commemoration for this event, as something to be celebrated, and the Catholics in general are quite happy about all this. Now, I want to be careful to state that this is not a condemnation of Catholic doctrine per se, because Catholics understand, just as much as Protestants, that people can be very sinful, and even popes can sin and do things that are wrong. But I also want to point out that for Protestants living in this time, the fact that the Catholics are persecuting them in these ways is a clear indication that they're the church of the Antichrist, and in fact not the true church. And for those who read the accounts of St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, I think you can understand, whatever your personal convictions are, why they might have thought this. If you're Roman Catholic, you have to understand just how terrible of a witness this is. Now, of course, nobody escapes unscathed. All branches of Christianity have done terrible things in the name of Christ, but I do think it's a very important warning to us that we need to heed, that we do not allow our zeal for Christ to overflow into sinful behaviors and practices. I think at the very least, Catholics can't run from this kind of history. They can't deny it or simply point the finger at Protestants and say Protestants did similar things. Because while it's true that Protestants also persecuted Catholics, I don't think there's anything quite to this scale, at least during the period of the Reformation, committed by Protestants against Roman Catholics. And for those who simply get upset at the Reformers or the Protestants for splitting from the Roman Catholic Church, again, I think it's very easy to understand why they might have thought this was not the true church, given how this church is acting towards them, acting in ways that are far from Christ-like, and in fact, one could label even as satanic. So that's a little bit of church history for you today. If you like this video, I'd encourage you to like and subscribe. I look forward to posting more videos like this one. I'm thinking a lot recently about the French Reformation, and so I'll probably do a bit more on that. Such a fascinating time, a colorful time full of amazing characters and crazy events that I look forward to discussing more with you. So thanks so much. See you soon.